Some of my ideas are related to the Bakhtinian notions. I think all of them are, because the other conceptual kind of, thinkers or partners that I'm drawing on are Gilles Deleuze and also Jacques Derrida, a little bit. Two major concepts that I'm drawing on from them. They have to do with this creation, the language and creativity. And on the other hand, Messianicity, as Derrida talks about it. So, and I'll bring in some of the ideas of Bakhtin, which overlap with these notions. And so I'll start with a couple of quotes from Sri Aurobindo on the future poetry. And I'm looking at this text, Savitri, as an example of future poetry. That is his critical text on the future of the English poetic tradition. So he's writing this book, Future Poetry, in response actually to a book called New Ways of English Literature that James Cousins, who was a theosophist who lived in Adyar, was writing. He wrote a history of English poetry. And so he's looking at this book and he's reflecting on it. And he's opening up this notion of the future poetry, as he calls it. Of course, his idea, so this is much earlier than the final version of Savitri that we have. So idea of future poetry is evolving, but these are its inception, the seeds of its inception. A couple of quotes from the first chapter, the introductory chapter. It says, "It is still uncertain how that future will deal with the old quarrel between idealism and realism. For the two tendencies these names roughly represent are still present in the tendencies of recent work. More generally, poetry always sways between these two opposite trends, towards predominance of subjective vision and towards an emphasis on objective presentation. And it can rise too beyond these to a spiritual plane, where the distinction is exceeded, the divergence reconciled." So this is one dialogue, you may say, that he's conducting and that he's moving towards in his conception of the future poetry. The other quote from the same chapter towards the end, that possibility of the discovery of this, of the future poetry, as he calls it, which he equates to the mantra, is the discovery of a closer approximation to what we might call the mantra in poetry, that rhythmic speech which, as the Veda puts it, rises at once from the heart of the seer and from the distant home of the truth, at once from both of these. The discovery of the word, the divine movement, the form of thought proper to the reality, which, as Mr. Cousins excellently says, lies in the apprehension of a something stable behind the instability of word and deed, something that is a reflection of the fundamental passion of humanity for something beyond itself, something that is a dim shadowing of the divine urge, which is prompting all creation to unfold itself and to rise out of its limitations towards its godlike possibilities. Poetry in the past has done that in moments of supreme elevation. In the future, there seems to be some chance of its making a more conscious aim and steadfast endeavor. So this is how he lays his scope for the future poetry. But as he develops the idea of the future poetry and of his own experiments, we come to the result that we call Savitri. And as you read from the letters, he is using it as an experiment for ascension to arrive at a certain ideal of expression. Expression as a kind of a, and I point out, it's a kind of a mutual determination, where, as you said, there is, on the one hand, something that is coming towards us, and on the other hand, we are moving towards that. the meeting point of these two. So what is future poetry? Why future poetry? And what are the stakes of the future poetry? These are the questions that I'd like to ask. The future poetry. So the future poetry, even in the term, it's talking about the power of language. And language we can talk about as having two extremes. On the one hand, the one extreme, we can call it the skin of language, which is science, scientific speech, or denotative language, where there is, a one-to-one meaning to everything. We all have to agree about that because there's no room for interpretation over there. We have to minimize the room for interpretation. And on the other hand, you have the notion of poetry. So, to what extent does the infinity of being incarnate itself in a time and space? There is always a bound infinity that incarnates itself. Over time, those bounds change. And that is where Heidegger uses his, famous quote, "Language is the house of being." Being incarnates itself and changes the time horizon, which, gives motion to history. And I would say language is the currency of human sociability. It is really what our culture affords us as universal ability to communicate. So language, on the one hand, it can be connotative language, which is the language of science. It follows a lexicon of conventional representation. On the other hand, you have poetry as a connotative language, follows an actualization of creative potential. And here I'd like to introduce a quotation from Gilles Deleuze, who is talking about this actualization process. And this is, again, just like you mentioned, it is taking a step away from the Kantian transcendental aesthetics, where you have really something which is determined from above, from the transcendent. See, so here there is a mutual co-determination that is taking place. So the quote from Deleuze, he's talking about ideas with a capital I, the notion of the idea, not as the Platonic idea, transcendental and fixed outside, but immanent and transcendent, rising from the heart and from the above at the same time, as Sri Aurobindo says. Mm-hmm. So he says, take, for example, the linguistic multiplicity, regarded as a virtual system of reciprocal connections between phonemes, which is incarnated in the actual terms and relations of diverse languages. Such a multiplicity renders possible speech as a faculty as well as the transcendent object of that speech, that meta-language which cannot be spoken in the empirical usage of a given language, but must be spoken and can be spoken only in the poetic usage of speech, coextensive with virtuality. So, in a way, in other words, it is in a reciprocal determination in which relational structures operating on the sea of sound isolate phonemic differentials, semantic, syntactic, and semiotic, which become actualized. And he uses the term differentiated, C-I-A-T-E-D. He has T-I-A-T-E-D, differentiated and differentiated as the two levels through which this, actualization of the infinite is taking place. So in the first level, the mutuality of relationships, what he's calling the virtual, you have relations, and these relations are operating on and being operated on by the sea of sound, you may say, the phonemic ocean. and they are being called into actualization under specific conditions of time, space, and culture. And as that call occurs, the mutual relations of the structure are determining how it comes, and then the mutual relation of the call and the movement determine the actual body of the word, of the language that emerges. So under specific spatial, temporal, and cultural conditions, in poetic language, this process is rendered transparent. So the language itself carries in it, as it were, this process. You can sense the universality behind it. You can sense the relations of the structures that are behind it. You can sense the potentia that have collapsed into the specific words that are in front of you. So you are expanded into that creative process as a receiver, just as you're bringing it into onto the page as a it bears very great similarity to what you're saying about dance and about the creative the polysemy of the gesture, of the dance gesture, so to say. So in poetic language, this process is rendered transparent so that the actualized product carries behind it the suggestive possibilities of creative choice, as well as the sense of infinity from which it emerged. The highest poetry renders most transparent and coextensive this process, incarnating it as a whole, the integral body of infinity in and as the finite body of words. So this is the meeting of the finite and the infinite. And to what extent, what is the power, degree of its incarnation determines the level of the poetry, in a sense. And this is, I'd say, in Sri Aurobindo's kind of, axiology of poetry as the future poetry. Sri Aurobindo invokes the tantric theory of Vak to indicate this potency. If the one infinite origin, inexpressible even by highest mind, is the Paravak, its self-experience in terms of self-presentation at the peak of mind is the seeing word, Pashyantivak. At this point, it is the fusion of a revelation and an inspiration. At once, the spatial flash of ideational image and the temporal volition of sonic directive. Ila and Saraswati, in the Vedic interpretation of Sri Aurobindo, conjoined. Sri Aurobindo equates this with the source of what he calls the overmind mantra, hearkening to the Veda. Giving expression to this would be the future poetry. So this is how he gives content to the idea of the future poetry as a potency of creativity in manifesting the creative process. Thus, the future poetry is a back to the future, an eternal return under new conditions of what was the stated conscious original potency of the poetic word in Vedic India. What makes it future is not a progressivist improvement on the past, but the problematic conditions of the present that are answered by it. What is the present as a problem that will call forth this future poetry? And here we come to, the notion, the even more appropriate notion of heteroglossia, the polyphonous nature of this creative word and the polyphonous nature of the present, of today. These conditions mimic in temporality the multiplicity of the linguistic idea, since postmodernity is a flattened coexistence of world histories. Though under the leveling pressure of an erasure of difference in the name of a homogeneous universal world history by the hegemony of neocolonialism, The future poetry activates the heterogeneous university, impressing itself uniquely on each cultural subject as a form of integral transmission. It is future also in its appropriation of the hegemonic language of the colonizer to effect the post-colonial transmission of integrality. Sri Aurobindo is defying the traditional norm that says that the origin of this idea in the Sanskrit language is the only sacrosanct medium of its transmission. He's saying today it can be the universal language that has been universalized by the colonizer, and we are appropriating it in a sense as a universal language to transmit through it the polyvocality of the postmodern, or the, of the present moving towards the future. The linguistic embodiment of this plane of immanence, the immanence that is in everything, the one plane that holds the infinity of, relations, the linguistic embodiment of this plane of immanence, conveying that which is at once one and infinite, was what Vivekananda indicated to Sri Aurobindo as the future evolution of the human mind in the Alipur jail. An opening to and conscious operation from the thousand-petaled lotus of Tantra, not in trance, but in waking expression. This is a major shift that Sri Aurobindo is introducing. Even in the synthesis of yoga, he's saying the consciousness must rise in waking outside of the human mind and take its residence in the thousand-petaled lotus. And the preparation for that is the opening up of these, what he calls the universal planes of language, that are more and more approximate to this one and infinite at the same time, giving us that power of language. The power of language that is the overhead mantra, the future poetry. So that's the experiment that he uses as poetry as yoga, to express that potency. The mother invoked it in a metaphor from the archives of Western magic as what she calls the gift of tongues, in which a congregation of different language speakers are spoken to in a language that is heard clearly by each person in their own language. This is an image of what Sri Aurobindo calls the supermind. Sri Ramakrishna has other images for it, very similar. He gives a parable, for example, of the dyer and the person who dyes cloth. This is an alchemical dyer, and he has a magic dye, and so he opens up shop. People come to him, he asks, what color do you want your cloth dyed? And the first person says yellow. Says yellow, he dyes it, it comes out yellow. The second person says blue, it comes out blue. So one man who has been watching all this, he goes finally to this person when nobody else is there, and he says, I want my cloth dyed. He says, what color do you want your cloth dyed? He said, I want it dyed the color that's in that vat. The color that's in that vat, which is the paradoxical color that contains all colors, which does not erase the colors in a whiteness. Yeah. This is exactly what you were saying. You see that it's the one infinite that does not erase, the metaphor of the paths going to the mountaintop or of the rivers running to the ocean is problematic in a sense because the rivers lose their name and form. The mountain, the paths lose their paths and become the mountaintop. But here you have that which can be heard distinctly by every different hearer, but at the same time is the one voice. See? So this is the power that we are looking for. This is the power of the future poetry. And I think this is also what Bakhtin is talking about as the ideal of creative expression. The linguistic, okay, so this is Sri Aurobindo, okay, the gift of tongues, but it is only in possessing the power of the speaker that each can replicate the creative word with integral potency. So this is the idea of the integral. Yeah. Sri Aurobindo used Savitri as an experiment to approximate this power of the future poetry in the English language. Its elusive cultural heteroglossia is accompanied by a psychological and temporal heterogeneity and integrality. Psychologically, its gift of tongues addresses directly each of the faculties. All the inner senses receive it separately and at once in an experience of synesthesia. So this is what gives this kind of poetry its density and its immersive nature. See, one encounters this uncanny sense often in the most powerful passages of Savitri, when its immersive quality grows most concrete. You seem to suddenly live it inside and outside. You are just, as you were saying, it's both manifesting in the environment that you're in, as well as growing inside you. In his commentary on the Kena Upanishad, Sri Aurobindo refers to this as the sense of the senses, the sixth sense, or manas, informed by the supramental samjnana. This is a form of sense knowledge that he's talking about as the unification of the senses that is operating behind the diversification of the senses, the two coexisting, so to say. The epic starts with the most powerful manifestation of this temporal integrality in the symbol dawn. So that's the beginning, the symbol dawn. So we're looking at three kinds of, this sort of heteroglossia. One is the culture, the dialogue of cultures even in Sri Aurobindo's own, inner dialogue in receiving the word. You have this tremendous cultural richness, which he's talking about in his poetry. He's referring to Kalidasa, he's referring to Dante, he's referring to Shakespeare, he's referring to the Upanishadic poets. All this is dialoguing in his consciousness in the drawing of these words, these passages. On the other hand, you have a kind of a synesthetic dialogue, that dialogue of the senses that is taking place, an immersive, unity that is being born through this fusion of the senses. And the third is what Bakhtin would have called a chronotopic, notion of multiple temporalities that form one temporality. See. So this is what we find in the symbol dawn, beginning with its very first line, "It was the hour before the gods awake." From the first line, we are simultaneously in multiple coexisting chronotopes. The mythical start of an age, as you were saying, this is the legendary, sort of Mahakala, the cosmic time. The mythical start of an age when the tendency towards manifestation, pravritti, emerges from the night of quiescence, nivritti. At the same time, it is the dawning of a day anywhere in the world, any day that's dawning in the world. Again, it's the dawning of a specific day in India with its temple culture. And even more specifically, it's the dawn of a special day in Savitri's life, the day when Satyavan will die. The dawn, again, so this is as far as the story goes, but the receiver, the one that is listening, it is the dawn of a special day for the reader, when the gods will be born in his or her consciousness. All these temporalities coexist and are one in a surreal hypertemporality, experienced all at once. This is part of the, idea of the future poetry as a transparency of infinity taking form, becoming actual. As the sun rises, the messianic real idea flashes. So this is, I'm coming now to the notion of messianicity, that the whole of Savitri, in a way, is talking about this structure of messianicity, the structure of time that is at a horizon that is pushing towards something new. The impossible, the supramental perfection that the finite does not hold, in a sense, to be precipitated. And that's the meaning structure of Savitri, as well as of consciousness in the idea of Savitri. So in Symbol Dawn, the movement from the beginning of the coming of the dawn, from the hour before the gods awake, it's like a kind of a crescendo, and then it ends again, it goes down to, there intervenes the light of common day. But at the height, when the dawn sun awakes, it reveals the time image. It reveals the idea, that Deleuze is talking about the idea of ideas, in a sense, the sign that encapsulates time and eternity, So he has that line, the brief perpetual sign recurred above. This brief perpetual sign, which is really the revelation, the flash of the idea that lies behind all time, is the genesis of time, the womb of time. So this is the messianic real idea. This heralds the central message of Savitri. Now, this messianic idea is in recent times talking about Kantian aesthetics and talking about time, or Hegelian aesthetics. It's really a always predictable meeting of forces, while what we're looking for is something that is always impossible. That's why it is messianic. That's why one is looking for a descent, an intervention, which is what Savitri is all about. And Sri Aurobindo foresees it. It's not with our resources and with our present history that we can manage the ideal. The ideal is always a rupture of history. And that rupture is an intervention of the Messiah. And so in our time, so the idea of the Messiah, as we get it in Christianity, or even if we talk about the avatar as a Messiah, these are specific cultural tropes. And Derrida is trying to recover that idea in our secular times as a kind of a secular notion of messianicity. He says messianicity without messianism. So the ideology of messianism isn't there, culturally, sort of bounded by some kind of history, but messianicity is there. So we have, Derrida refers to the messianic structure as an onto-existential praxis. This is a praxis that all of us can actually, embody. And Savitri, in a sense, is embodying it and also inviting us to embody it. In that sense, it is its message. Setting a horizon on the unimaginable paradox of perfection, the justice, democracy, hospitality of friendship to come, a heterogeneous otherness where the infinite and the finite meet without erasing each other. For Derrida, extrapolating from his Jewish origins, this is a messianicity without messianism, a secular praxis with the Messiah always to come. You see, this is the whole thing about the dialogue between Judaism and Christianity, which says the Messiah came. And Derrida would say, well, if that Messiah came, there is still a Messiah to come.
Yeah.
Right? It's in a way, it's like the Indian idea where there is no end to the avatar. Even the 10 avatar system is only one system. There can be many avatars to come.
Yeah.
So the avatar who is always to come, the Messiah who is always to come, is more the Judaic idea. But Derrida secularizes it into a time structure for us to live in our everyday lives, a secular praxis with the Messiah always to come, what he calls a hauntology. A hauntology. In other words, not just an ontology, not just being as it is, but being infected with a certain something which is lacking, that is calling for something to catapult us beyond the ontology. A hauntology subverting expectations and precipitating the limit conditions of human praxis. So to quote from Derrida, it refers in every here now to the coming of an eminently real, concrete event, that is, to the most irreducible heterogeneous otherness. Nothing is more realistic or immediate than this messianic apprehension, straining forward towards the event of him who that which is coming. I say apprehension because this experience, strained forward towards the event, is at the same time a waiting without expectation, an active preparation, anticipation against a backdrop of a horizon, but also exposure without horizon, and therefore an irreducible amalgam of desire and anguish, affirmation and fear, promise and threat. Messianicity mandates that we interrupt the ordinary course of things, of time and history, here and now. It is inseparable from an affirmation of otherness and justice. So that unquote. So that is Derrida's quote. But I'd say with Sri Aurobindo, we find a post-secular messianic praxis in which a transcendent agent without predictable name or feature participates continuously. It is really calling upon that which goes outside the boundaries of time, that is becoming time. It's post-secular in that sense. It participates continuously, precipitating post-human potentia in a continuous rupture of time horizons. It is an integral messianism of this kind that is invoked through the heteroglossia of multiple subject positions and multiple chronotopes in Savitri. So we have this, Savitri is giving us the same time structure in a different way, in different cantos and with different subjects. It's as if these are multiple subject positions of the author himself. The author, the multiplicity of the author and the relationality of the author. At the human level, messianism marks the book of fate. In the dialogue of the Queen of Madra, Savitri's mother, with Narada, human misfortune is to be taken as the foundation of a praxis of messianic faith or Shraddha, invoking the unexpected and unpredictable as its temporal horizon. This is the gist of the conversation between, Savitri's mother says, take back your word. Let's go back to the past. Let's go back to the point where the mistake was made. And let's start from afresh. And Narada is saying, no, Savitri is saying the word cannot be taken back. The word once given is final. Narada is saying, no, history cannot be erased. Anything once precipitated, however erroneous, is the condition for a future that you cannot see. Your job is not to go back to the past. Your job is to open to a faith of the future. So that is the messianicity that informs Savitri's mother in that sense. At the yogic level, messianicity marks the book of the traveler of the worlds in the aspiration and exploration of Ashwapati with the same unknowable temporal horizon met by the appearance and promise of the Divine Mother. So here we have the interesting thing is that Ashwapati at the borders of the unknowable even forgets his aspiration. He's about to merge into the unknowable. It's like you were saying, in face to face with the dancer, face to face with the cosmic agent, one's prayers and questions disappear. It's a moment of absolute, irreducible darshan in that sense. The two become one while remaining the two. So this is what happens to Ashwapati at the peaks of the unknowable, as Sri in the pursuit of the unknowable. And that's when he's just about to disappear, as it were, that something dawns on him. The messianic moment occurs. The Divine Mother comes, and he's given the vision of the future, the vision and the boon, as the canto is called. At the psychic level, messianicity marks the life of Satyavan, doomed to death in a sacrifice, redeemable only by the temporal horizon of the intervention of the incarnate divine Shakti, Savitri. So this is the messianicity of the soul, which is like Christ, always sacrificed on a cross and calling for that rupture to overcome death. And finally, at the cosmic level, messianism marks the relation and dialogue of Savitri with death. It's mounting pressure, forcing the emergence of the eschaton in the messianic intervention. Savitri grows into her own. She's an avatar in potential. But it is only when she's faced with the problematic conditions of the present, that the fullness of her supramental reality breaks through to solve or answer. That's the messianism of Savitri. These subject positions, human, yogic, psychic, and cosmic, with their corresponding moods of messianic praxis, which I've referred to as faith, aspiration, surrender, and receptivity, are relived both in the author and the reader. This is what we take these positions and integrate them in ourselves, that they are dialogic positions in ourselves. We are all these beings, these positions. They are identified in the distant Vedic past. So this is the interesting thing. As you mentioned, Sri Aurobindo is getting this story from the Mahabharata. But if you look at the preface or the little write-up that he gives at the beginning of Savitri, he is attributing it to the Veda. He's saying it's a lost story from the Veda because of the nature of the names and the nature of the message, that it gets lost, but it resurfaces in a certain version in the Mahabharata. And now it is reappearing again. So again, we have this sense of time that repeats, that is in the beginning is prepared the close, as he says, in the middle, in the today, and in the future. These are identified in the distant Vedic past. in the marvelous history of Satyavan and Savitri, simultaneously superimposed on the present in the messianic ministry of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, and equally invoked as occult forces and internal actions in the reader as the temporal horizon of the individual and cosmic future.